Recently, there's been a lot of controversy over the question of American patriotism. Many on the left have cast stones in Jackson Hinkle's direction, claiming that one cannot be both a patriot and a socialist in America, given its origin as a settler colonialist venture and its current status as the leading imperialist power. Many have gone so far to claim that, as socialists, patriotism represents an affront to the principle of internationalism, and that socialists who speak in patriotic terms are both inconsistent and on the road to red-brownism. In spite of these protestations by the American left, it is clear that there is something deeply wrong with this position. The reality of the American people is not, in fact, going anywhere, and the anarchistic burn-it-all-down approach has done nothing but isolate the left since the 1960s. This begs the question, what was the actual relationship between socialists and patriotism historically?
What becomes immediately clear is that the track record of the 19th and especially 20th centuries show that socialists and communists have consistently been patriotic and deeply attuned to the national realities of the countries they hail from. The only reason why the question of patriotism has now come to the fore is because up until recently it has been a given. And in point of fact, it is still a given in the vast majority of countries today. It is only in America and those under the influence of its empire, where those under the sway of American exceptionalism remain dominant on the left, that socialists imagine they can elevate themselves above national realities and speak on behalf of an abstract working class, uprooted and estranged from its particular and national instantiation. But historically speaking, it is a plain and obvious fact that communists were always patriotic and deeply rooted in the national traditions of their respective countries. Marx, who spoke of the unity of working people from all countries, states in the same work that, though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. And 27 years later, in his critique of the Gotha program, Marx calls it a self-evident fact that, in order to be able to fight at all, the working class must organize itself at home as a class, with its own country as the immediate arena of its struggle. Although the substantial meaning is class struggle, Marx is abundantly clear that its initial form is national. Lenin, who advocated for revolutionary defeatism during the First World War, never considered this position to be at odds with patriotism on behalf of the Russian people. We love our language and our country, and we're doing our very utmost to raise our toiling masses to the level of democratic and socialist consciousness. In fact, the imperialist war was cast as an unpatriotic commitment to the international financiers, capitalists, and enemies of the people who dominated the nation. We are full of a sense of national pride, and for that very reason we particularly hate our slavish past and our slavish present, where these self-same landed proprietors, aided by the capitalists, are loading us into a war. Such war only serves to strengthen the gang of Romanovs and Brobinskys, who are a disgrace to our great Russian national dignity. And he goes on, it is impossible to defend the fatherland otherwise than by using every revolutionary means to combat the monarchy, the landowners, and the capitalists of one's own fatherland, i.e., the worst enemies of our country. Mao, conversely, situated the Communist Party in a patriotic people's war against the Japanese aggressors, while mocking the false patriotism of Hitler and the Japanese imperialist. Can a communist who is an internationalist at the same time be a patriot? We hold that he not only can be, but also must be. The content of patriotism, Mao writes, is determined by historical conditions. As Mao observed, in China, the Communist Party's patriotism lay in national liberation, whereas in Germany and Japan it lay in revolutionary defeatism. To bring about the defeat of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler is in the interest of the Japanese and German people, for their wars are harming the people at home as well as the people of the world. The same holds universally true for revolutionaries in Cuba, Vietnam, and across the rest of the world. Marxist-Leninists never advocated on behalf of an abstract, supranational working class, nor did they preach the destruction of their own nations and berate their own people for their ostensible backwardness. On the contrary, Marxist-Leninist parties were successful for the precise reason that they could connect with and give body to the strivings of a concrete and determinate people, rather than superimposing on them foreign and abstract doctrines. And as evinced by the DDR, Polish People's Republic, and other Eastern Bloc states, this grounding of the communist parties in the soil of their own people was not incidental to their country's involvement in the process of decolonization. The indisputable fact that communism invariably assumed a deeply national and patriotic form is not in fact due to happenstance, but is directly tied up with the essence of socialism itself.
In other words, that socialism had assumed patriotic and national form is not due to the opportunism of socialist and communist parties, but was part and parcel to the meaning of socialism itself. As first stated by Marx, and later elaborated upon by Stalin and Mao, the universal truth of Marxism finds expression only in specific national characteristics and in its acquisition of a definite national form. As one must begin with the realities that actually exist, and not proceed from abstractions of the imagination, so too must one first and foremost recognize the national realities in the land itself that gives rise to a definite and historical people. It is only from a recognition of this premise that what is common between a people can come to the fore. It is in this way that socialism discloses a people's living and material being, or what Heidegger would call their historical Dasein, the meaning of their history, tradition, and their cultural achievements. Rather than leave the nation to the usurpers of the people, allowing the latter's legacy to rot in extravagance, waste, and in war, socialism means the revitalization and the reignition of a people, while still remaining faithful to the same modernity that begs the social question to begin with. All of this is to say is that socialism, far from coming at the expense of the realities of the people, is wrought out of their particular and national realities. The principal mistake of Western leftists is to assume an abstractly negative position with regards to the peoples, nations, and history of the world. For these Western leftists, the essence of socialism exists in spite of the concrete sociality, or the living being, of a people. They proceed from heaven to earth, whereas Marx's materialism proceeds from earth to heaven. They proceed from empty abstractions, from cosmopolitan man uprooted from his substantive base, whereas Marxism teaches us to proceed from the people as they actually exist. And despite what the insular pockets of denationalized American youth think, who exempt themselves from those national, familial, and cultural premises not subject to reason, the objectivity of the nation, including its rights, rituals, and the national spirit defining a people, is something which communists should strive to authentically express rather than ignore. The realities of the nation cannot be wished away, nor cheaply be considered a spook. They must be given new life and new direction, a revival that communists are tasked with showing is impossible, if not for the overthrow of the decrepit oligarchical establishment that is as foreign to the American people as it is to the countries it occupies. In short, the task of communists is not to alienate themselves from the masses, but to give expression to the contradiction between the ruling establishment and the people. The denationalized suburban leftists might imagine this to be a deeply chauvinistic and nationalist position, but it is the reactionaries who in fact share with them a one-sided and idealist conception of the nation. Like the liberal cosmopolitans, reactionaries confuse the outward appearance of the nation with its essence, which is inexhaustible and irreducible to its existent form. Rather than keeping up with the reality of the people, they restrict the development of their national being with the weight of dead abstractions. Reactionaries, in their idolatry of superficial appearance, are not sufficiently rooted in the traditions of their own people. This same idealism permeates the idolaters' corrupted vision of internationalism, a word long since abused by the post-60s left. Internationalism, for the fake and anti-popular left, exists at the expense of national realities. The revolution, it is imagined, abolishes borders, peoples, and nations all at once, on the basis of their offense to universal reason, justice, or other golden idols. That which is irrational is, upon being shown proof of its unreasonableness, bound to disappear into the annals of history. But as the irony of history shows, reason is cunning. What appears irrational is only the contradiction between appearance and its own essence. It is the development of the essence of the nation that proceeds from national premises itself. And that is why, for Marxists historically, internationalism comes into being through the nation, and corresponded to a deepening of national realities rather than their forsaking. Meanwhile, the synthetic left's position, as a perfected image of American unipolarity, realizes itself in the liquidation and the wholesale extermination of the peoples of the world. And it reflects inwardly too, including in it a war on the peoples of one's own country. The abstractly negative internationalism of Western leftists is nothing less than the photo-negative of American unipolarity. It is this false and abstract universality that steamrolls the wealth of the world's peoples, identical in form to the relation classical modernity bore to the countries left behind by the West. It is this false notion of internationalism that is the last remnant of classical modernity which is yet to be tempered by contact with its own material premises. The ideal of a communist world, which was made actual for one half of the earth at one point in time, always meant a fraternity of nations. The internationalist position, far from being the rejection of national and civilizational realities, is the promotion of win-win bilateral cooperation, the kind hearkened by a multipolar world, whose material premises are being set as we speak. The internationalist position corresponds to the resumption of the founding ideal of America, a country free from empire, with as little political connection with other countries as possible.
Socialism, we've seen, has always come out of love for one's people, not of their crucifixion on the device of modernity, as Trotskyites and left-wing fanatics conceive of it. But many American leftists, who may be comfortable conceding these points, will inevitably claim the following: that America, for reasons particular to it, cannot be redeemed, that furthermore, its position as imperialist hegemon makes any socialist patriotism assume a chauvinistic and imperialist form. While it is a truism that the origins of the United States lay in the wholesale slaughter of the indigenous population, this does not diminish the objective significance of the United States. Since its foundations in the chartering of the Declaration of Independence from the British Empire, the United States had acquired for itself a real place among the nations of the world, which, even if unique in the intensity and barbarism, is, like all nations, founded on the basis of robbery and exploitation, and, like all nations, it contains within itself the conditions for redemption. The simple fact of the matter is that the United States is almost 2.5 centuries old. Those who presently inhabit the United States as the white majority are not settlers or colonists. The birth of the United States has seen the development of various local and quasi-national traditions with deep roots, from Appalachian Americans to the Black Belt. They have long since become indigenized, and it is in fact their uprooting at the hands of the American oligarchy that constitutes a proletarianization of white America. The condemnation of America as a settler colony thinly disguises the hatred and repulsion of American leftists towards their own people. It adulterates the concrete demands of Native Americans for more land and more autonomy and twists it into an impossible position that only insulated white radicals could stand behind. It elevates the right of self-determination of Puerto Rico and Guam into a universal and abstract negation of all American land in general, an elevation nobody asked for, and which arrives at the laughable absurdity that the vast majority of those who live, work, and reproduce America have no right to live in it. This is why communism has nothing to do with land back and everything to do with land reform. It is only in the reparcellation of land as the most basic means of production that the productive capacities and entrepreneurial spirit of the American people can be unleashed. Where land back is a feel-good pipe dream for the overwhelmingly white American left, land reform expresses the strivings of the populistic and anti-establishment sentiments of the majority. The vacuous and performative land-back position of American leftists, meanwhile, bears no organic connection with the actual claims of American Indians, who are used as cannon fodder for the Calvinist left seeking to extirpate itself of all the sins of its forefathers. The extremity of such a position can only be made in the minds of those who are insulated from such communities and from working people in general. What they channel, in fact, is nothing more than their own mental reconstruction of American Indians and other historically oppressed groups. Such mental reconstructions, which bear little resemblance with the realities of black and indigenous peoples, are utilized solely for the purpose of invoking feelings of moral superiority and leveraging this over their peers. The moral economy that land back and other childish rhetoric rest upon is thus only for the purpose of satiating the feelings of guilt felt by white leftists. The impossibility of these demands is clear to all parties, including themselves, and as a matter of strategy, such extremist positions will never win over the American masses, not even her non-white sections, as their puritanical finger-pointing distances them more and more from the American people. Strategically, it is a non-position, which is why J-Sakai leftists never have and never will pose a threat to the existing establishment and are in practice the radical left flank of actually existing white supremacy. Communists do not win by opposing everything the American people find sacred, a childish and anarchistic position. They do not win with a burn-it-all-down attitude. Communists will win by fighting for American working people, giving them recognition in their words and in their deeds, and promoting the prosperity and dignity of America's working masses. That one finds pride in their country and love for her people is in no way irreconcilable with making good on the promise of 40 acres and a mule, nor does it annul the necessity of recompense and dialogue with tribal authorities and the increased autonomy that socialist reconstruction would give way to. On the contrary, it is a precondition for these things, as patriotic sentiment is the surest sign that one is connected with and fights on behalf of the masses. The reality is that land-back leftists who screech and bemoan the fact of America's existence do the work of the right by poisoning the well with all sorts of unjustifiable and impossible demands that they themselves don't believe. And whether they are aware of it or not, these same people open the door to the exact claims being levied against the People's Republic of China, and to a lesser extent Russia, another convenient coincidence where radical liberal discourse mysteriously aligns with US imperialism.
But the confusion of such people over land back, which can never be a communist demand, pales in comparison with the chief stupidity of American leftists, which is that working people in the advanced countries are incapable of acting in a revolutionary way. Such stupidity is refuted not only by a look at history, but is even denied by the same authorities that Maoist LARPers claim descent from. Lenin, in his letter to the American working people, lauded the war the American people waged against the British robbers who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery. Unsurprisingly more attuned to the realities of America than most Western students of Lenin, he also did not hesitate to point out the continuity between the war for independence and communism. The American people have a revolutionary tradition which has been adopted by the best representatives of the American proletariat, namely, that tradition which is the war of liberation against the British in the 18th century and the Civil War in the 19th. Mao, leading a country directly threatened by US imperialism, would at the same time posthumously ratify George Washington a communist, referring to both Washington and Lincoln as progressive men of their time. Far from land-back virtue signaling or condemning the white working class as settler colonialists, he would state that now the American people need to struggle for liberation from their own monopoly capitalists. If Marx, Lenin, and Mao, among numerous others, saw in America's history a world historic and revolutionary tradition, then how could American communists not see the same? If communists with no ties to America can respect the legacy of 1776, then what clowns would one be to discard it and curse it as an original sin? What message does it send to the people when the institutions of the establishment seem to concur with the liquidationism of the American left? As the proletarian class struggle is always particular and determinate, it is clear that a socialism arising from the soil of America will take the form of something profoundly and deeply American. That socialism in America will have American characteristics. What's more is that by assuming it is only the Eastern proletariat that is capable of attaining a revolutionary character, so-called Maoists in America commit the inverse error of Western social democrats of the early 20th century. Both sharing a lack of dialectical thinking, they assume that America and her people are an exception. They might label socialism with American characteristics Browderism, but it is in fact they who are the Browderists, if only inversely. For they, in the words of Stalin, imagine America to be exempt from the laws of history. The fact of the matter is that for all we can say of its founding, America has a mighty and authentically progressive tradition that has been present from the beginning. The war for independence threw off the imperial yoke and founded a republic that, for the first time, based itself in the same Enlightenment ideals that would be weaponized in the forthcoming anti-slavery crusade and the struggle against European colonialism worldwide. The Civil War, whose world historic repercussions did not go unobserved by Marx, was at the same time a deeply national war against the British imperialists, who threw their support behind the Confederacy. And as Marx would observe, from the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. It was under this banner that the oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders was vanquished by Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class. From the Farmers' Alliance and the Populist Party, to the role played by the labor unions and the communists of the 1930s, America has hosted a long gallery of heroic struggles which have gone on to be appreciated by Marxist-Leninists around the world. And this gallery has extended up into the present. As the populist tide threatens to upend the security-obsessed elite, socialists are in a unique position to play a profound role in the rejuvenation of the American people. Popular demands for Medicare for all, suspicion over the designs of Big Pharma and the intrusions of Big Tech, the arrogance and the hypocrisy of the establishment, these are all demands that are ripe for leadership. But with the American left so estranged from the people, with its voices dominated by lumpen elements so infantile and explicitly hostile to their very existence, who are the good people of America to turn to, except pivoting endlessly between two parties of the same establishment? Rather than patriotically fighting for what is near and dear to the people, self-proclaimed socialists are either aloof from or spit vitriol in the direction of America's working masses. Such people are complicit with the ruling establishment. Indeed, they are its leftist flank. Western leftists make the mistake of opposing what is good to what is real, whereas for dialectical materialists, reconciliation means finding the good in the real. It is no coincidence, then, that the decline of the American empire coincides with the awakening of the American people and their own war against it, and that civilizational reconstruction of the Americas can only come from reclaiming the American Republic from the American Empire. As Lenin understood revolutionary defeatism to be the truly patriotic stance of World War I, so too is anti-imperialism the highest form of American patriotism, another long-standing American tradition seemingly lost by leftists today. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. That the patriotism of America's neoconservatives has only amounted to bloodshed, restriction of civil liberties, deindustrialization, and civilizational decline shows that it was a false patriotism all along. Communists in America should not exempt themselves from world history, nor should they be afraid to cut ties with the synthetic left that will inevitably scold it for pandering. To refuse American exceptionalism is to claim the American flag as the people's flag, lest it remain in the hands of those who betray the masses, selling the daughters of America into prostitution and its sons into destitution. That the flag remains in the hands of fake conservatives is only because the left has proven too impotent and too weak to claim it for themselves. Time-honored wisdom tells us to remove the splinter from one's own eye before criticizing. That communists have made no headway in America for the past 60 years is not because the American people are too ignorant, but because the left has been dominated by fanatical and anti-popular elements. Socialists have never won power by scolding their people and trampling upon every sacred institution dear to their heart. The task of communists is not to moralize and to shame, but to relate to the concrete realities of the American people, to forge a party that is capable of acting as a tribune for the people from which it is cultivated. It is only in this way that the false patriots can be overthrown, the enemies of the people routed, and popular sovereignty established. It is by failing to act as patriots and by being unique in condemning their own people that American leftists set themselves apart from communists and socialists around the world. They are American exceptionalists par excellence. American socialist patriotism, meanwhile, correctly charts the Stalinist golden middle. So what is the concrete meaning of American patriotism? It will be found in a new separation from the moribund British Empire and its international liberalism, in the refoundation of the American Republic in alliance with the BRICS nations, and in civilizational renewal through a program of land reform and reindustrialization. Socialism with American characteristics will be found in reclaiming sovereignty from the empire that the oligarchs inherited from the British. Rather than forsaking the masses from which it was born, socialism in America means reclaiming the story and the flag of America. It means assuming leadership of its working people, and acting, in both words and in deeds, in continuity with traditions of the United States, making good on its promise of a republic of, by, and for the people.